In our top story, the National Treasury has spoken on the KPMG fiasco. Finance Minister Malusi Gigaba has asked all government departments and their entities to review all the work done by KPMG to ensure that the audit processes have not been compromised. In a statement, Treasury says these developments have created a bad image and they have undermined the reputation of good governance and audit independence, which is one of the key sectors and institutions of our economy. Treasury wants that the relevant law enforcement and bodies such as the Independent Regulatory Board for Auditors to look into this matter to identify and to sanction those responsible for any wrongdoing. KPMG recently withdrew its report into the so-called SARS Rogue Unit and apologized for its work done for the Oak Bay. Now KPMG faces credibility crisis following its own admission of wrongdoing. Treasury has asked government entities to review their work with KPMG, and SARS says current and past work done by KPMG for the government must be stalled and reviewed. KPMG has contracts with several state entities like the National Treasury, SAA, SARS and the Public Protector Office. KPMG has in the past worked on the arms deal case, and KPMG has commercial ties with almost 70 Johannesburg Stock Exchange listed companies. Now there's more trouble for the auditing agency. Business Leadership South Africa has suspended KPMG's membership, and South African Institute of Chartered Accountants will launch an inquiry into the members employed by the KPMG. And audit watchdog IRBA will be accounting to Parliament on their probe into KPMG. And recently, SASFIN dropped KPMG and as its JSE sponsor and auditor. Odisani Limited also moved to replace KPMG. South African banking group Investec has dumped the firm. Asset management company Signia have also ended their contract. Barclays Africa is reviewing its relationship with KPMG. Now, joining us in studio to discuss this further is Mr. Tsepo Khadima, political analyst, and I will also have Mr. Jabu Mahlangu from SANCO spokesperson joining us live on the phone. And of course, we'll have Mr. Sidney Sekese, that's a certified financial planner and FPI member in studio. You're at home. Welcome to join in the conversation. Our Twitter handle at ANN7 TV. Gentlemen, very good evening to you. Thank you for joining us today.
Good evening.
Mr. Khadima, can KPMG come out of this?
No, I think KPMG is irredeemable, and I just don't see how they can come out of this on a number of fronts. A week has gone by, they've still not been able to explain what triggered their purported withdrawal of certain sections of that report. And they also have still not offered the alternative finding if those that they purport to be withdrawing, they say that they are no longer valid. And also they have not gone on record as to who actually complained 18 months after the effect. So one can only see that or can only suspect, and I think legitimately so, that there must have been undue pressure. And that undue pressure should have been brought about probably by the private sector companies, which we've seen that most of them have moved, and I would say irregularly and not as per the memorandum of incorporation of their companies, by saying they will no longer have KPMG as their auditor, when we should know as a matter of course that the appointment of auditors is the privilege of shareholders and not of management. So you've got companies that are even listed on the JSE that have pleaded. But even more bizarre is that, for example, the investment banking firm Investec is itself having been accused together with KPMG in having covered up the 26 billion rand fraud at JCI, which was run by the late Brett Cable. And we know that the late investigative journalist Barry Sargent, in fact, wrote extensively, including even publishing a book on that 26 billion rand fraud. And today you have Investec that says we no longer will be having KPMG as our auditor. And you ask, well, when was their special general meeting of the shareholders or an annual general meeting where they could have taken such a decision? But
I mean, there's a huge amount of money that we're talking about, companies that are pulling out from the private sector and from the government, the state-owned enterprises, the departments within the state-owned enterprises that have had to cease their work with KPMG and have all this work reviewed. Just going back to the report that the KPMG wants to pull out, Mr. Sekese, perhaps you could help us with this. The copy was finalized. It now belongs to SARS. They paid for it. Is it even legal for KPMG to even consider doing this?
Yeah, look, I think it's prudent for us to pause and take a step back and say, look, there's a dark cloud around the auditing firm and also the accounting profession. So, the profession is faced with a VUCA moment, which is that of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. I think I want to replace volatility with vulnerability. So they are quite vulnerable, and the steps that they take are not calculated. So they need to sit back and really take calculated moves before they can make undue steps.
Right.
Yes.
And speaking of audit watchdogs, let's get Mr. Mahlangu. Very good evening to you. Thank you for joining us. I do hope that you can hear me. KPMG came out on their own and said, look, what we did was illegal. We didn't do the right thing. We have audit watchdogs that have not been able to sort of oversee, our audit firms here in South Africa. That a lot could be happening, not just KPMG. What responsibilities do they have?
Actually, good evening. Just when you were talking with the other gentleman, you were very clear, but when you came to me, the voice was distorted. But I heard you towards the end, and indeed, I think a few things that we have to take into account that the world has finally properly globalized. And therefore, companies that have got a footprint across the globe have got a responsibility to be good corporate citizens of the world. And what we have seen with the company recently reminds us of what we saw with Enron in 2001. And it is a sad moment, but I guess as SANCO, we should welcome the decision by the Minister of Finance to give the necessary directives to all state entities and as well as government departments. And we are hoping that it shouldn't just be a question of renewal, but a directive to terminate the relationship, because KPMG have put itself into serious disrepute, and a lot still needs to be told. There is a responsibility to be accountable for what has happened, because indeed, as the previous speakers have said, they have not come out to say that's what's happened. And our view is that because the Auditor General uses KPMG quite a lot in the works that are being carried out in public departments, municipalities, provinces, it is crucial that both the Auditor General as well as the Financial Services Board acts immediately on KPMG in the same way as SASFIN have decided to terminate their audit tender with KPMG. And we welcome that most of our companies have taken the similar stand, because the issue of accountability, transparency, cannot just be the responsibility of government alone. Public entities, private sector have a responsibility to account, and we are glad that we have reached this stage, because it tells a bigger story about what happens behind what is perceived as these clean slates of good corporate governance, and everything that goes bad is in government. I think this revelation indicates that we have a lot to oversight, especially over the private sectors, and therefore board members who are overseers of these companies have a huge responsibility to do their work, because they have fiduciary responsibilities to shareholders to hold these entities to account, and to be, as I mentioned at the beginning, to be good corporate citizens.
Mr. Khadima, the Treasury says they want the relevant law enforcement to act upon this. But do you think they'll also be taking the decision to stop all work with KPMG and have all the work that has been done within the Treasury departments reviewed? Look, I don't know if they've been clear about that.
I just cannot see how National Treasury can act in any other manner other than what they have already pronounced in terms of reviewing all the work that has been done to date. Obviously, we do not have the scope and the terms of reference of that review, and the timelines. So that is again very worrying that, how long will this firm be in limbo for? And hence I'm saying that I think this is the end of the road. It's a very, I think, very sad that 15 years after the collapse of Arthur Andersen, KPMG, which acquired the Arthur Andersen franchise in South Africa, is itself today now, I think, suffering the same fate. Because Arthur Andersen suffered the fate when the courts, rather the law enforcement agencies in the United States indicted, the Attorney General indicted the executives of Arthur Andersen. That was the end of the road, because there wasn't any other person on this planet who was ever going to use Arthur Andersen. To this day, you'll never find any chartered accountant who will proudly say that I was trained at Arthur Andersen, which ran a very huge academy for training of accountants. And KPMG, unfortunately, here in South Africa, and I think even beyond, is going to be. If I was advising KPMG, and I'm not advising KPMG, but this is after the effect, had a court of law in South Africa made a finding to set aside the findings that they contain in their report, they really had a fighting chance. If a court of law would have investigated and then came to that. So the question becomes as to whoever that approached KPMG 18 months after the effect and demanded that they must rescind certain section of some of the work that they did, that was the end of the road for them. They should have allowed a court due process. And also the other thing that is astonishing for me is that you've got executives here who seemingly were very happy to waive their due process rights, audi alteram partem. There should have been a due process before those executives were to be shown the door. So
that brings me to my next question. What happens to the new team that then comes into place, Mr. Sekese? What kind of challenges would they have to face going forward, should KPMG survive?
Yeah, I've got a different viewpoint, or a slightly, suggestion in terms of uprooting the rod, and rather than painting the whole company as bleak as it is, there are individuals who have been responsible for that, and the institution has gotten the ability to debar whoever has caused this mess, and a prudent approach would be to really uproot the rod and remove whoever was responsible for that as a practicing auditor or a practicing accountant. So that could be another approach. So in terms of the current members, they need to be thoroughly investigated and a proper due diligence taken.
Do you think there's hope for KPMG after this going forward, Mr. Sekese? So that's what I'm trying to establish from you. You seem very hopeful, but we've seen the damage that has happened, and just the reputation on its own for a company is something that is huge, that I'm sure every corporate prides itself in.
Yeah, no, my feeling is that once maybe a commission of inquiry is in place and findings are put on the table, they need to stick to that, and let the law take its course. And once that is done, I think there could be some hope. I'm cautiously optimistic.
I want to go to Mr. Mahlangu. Can we really rely on internal processes of private audit firms? Of course, we have watchdogs that don't seem to really be doing very well when it comes to overseeing these audit firms.
Well, you see, we have interesting experiences in the private sectors. And every time you have a serious crack, they just pamper it with paper, and it's not going to work. Our view is that, and we did make the call, that the hawks must come in. They should press charges against, because crime has been committed, corruption has actually occurred, and they can't self-correct. We need external forces to come in to unravel the wrath that is in KPMG. And indeed, even the people that have jumped ship, our view is that they should still face the music. It just can't be the fact that when you have messed up big time, bordering on affecting the sovereignty of a state, And we know that we've suffered the downgrades and we have all the negative, projections about South Africa and the rest. And KPMG is at the center of some of these things. And our view is that people must face the music, and those that have resigned should be called back and they should face music. They just can't hope that the jumping ship is all they need to do, and therefore a sanction has happened. They need thorough legal, criminal sanctions and corruption sanctions meted against them. And indeed, it is time that oversight bodies should kick in to do oversight. Well, like I said earlier on, we have had experiences where corruption happens in private sector, and it's called, given a very nice name, collusion, when certain things happen, just to cover up serious corruption. And that's why our view is that, indeed, as much as some of them have fallen on their swords, but they should be arisen and they should face the might of the law. And as I said, that we live in a globalized world, and I think Globe should actually respond to this question, because that's where we are, and because KPMG is a global player.
Mr. Chadima, do you think this is just the tip of the iceberg, what we're seeing coming out, this backlash on KPMG and all these issues that are being reviewed?
Look, the question is, why are we so concerned and spending so much airtime talking about KPMG? We have to bear in mind that our economy is 4.1 trillion rand. So you have to say, well, out of that 4.1 trillion rand, the state is directly responsible for a quarter. So, 75% of this economy is sitting in private sector, which is subject to being audited. So the auditing profession here is at risk. And it's not just KPMG, because the questions have to be extended and asked of all other auditing firms, that can we rely on the statements that they produce? Can the South African Revenue Service rely on the statements that are produced by these auditing firms as to what is due? For example, in this country, the corporate sector is only contributing no more than 20% to our 1.1 trillion rand that we do in income tax, because they employ armies of accountants to help them not to pay tax, and they're succeeding so. So now those questions have to be asked to say, well, could we be collecting more tax, but that the auditing profession, and as we see in this case, that they are assisting in commission of a crime and the crime of tax evaders by the corporate companies, which are not contributing their fair share as they're supposed to be. So I think this is, I can't see how KPMG as a firm with that name brand can continue.
Yeah, but other auditing firms need to be looked into as well.
All of them.
Course, right now
the
focus
auditing profession
is on
in its entirety.
Do you think, Mr. Sekesa, this has opened a can of worms for other auditing firms to be held accountable, not just for companies to trust their internal processes and really no oversight?
Yeah. Going forward, you're going to see a lot of stakeholder activism. So most stakeholders, especially institutional funds, they have to adhere to ESG, environmental, social and governance issues in terms of selecting service providers. So going forward, there's going to be a lot of interrogation. I foresee that happening. And I've also been thinking about the process of auditing and of maybe legitimizing the opinions by these auditors. Perhaps there should be second opinions. Instead of relying on only one opinion, it would be prudent to have 2 or 3 opinions to make it, to compare. Yeah. If there's a huge misalignment, then the stakeholders would inquire further.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We'll have to leave it there, gentlemen. Thank you so much for your input, Mr. Tsepo Chadima. I appreciate you. Mr. Sydney Sekesa, Certified Financial Planner and FPI member. We also had Mr. Jabu Mahlangu, Sanco spokesperson, joining us there on the phone line. Thank you so much for your time, gentlemen.